Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So, last week we talked about questions and having questions. And I was thinking that maybe this week we could sort of maybe enter the question a little bit more. I'm trying to maybe determine for myself if I was coming from a cerebral place last week when talking about questions, and I suspect that maybe I was. But I think that having a question is such a deep and fundamental aspect of this practice. It's sort of difficult to gauge the breadth of it. Because on one hand, we can have the question in this sort of cerebral way, and yet in this way it sort of removes us from the immediacy of our experience. I mean, to sort of ask, why am I alive, or why am I here? It sort of removes us from the reality of that experience, as if you could be somewhere else or someone else. I mean, these questions are sort of silly in a way. I'm thinking about this Henry David Thoreau idea when he's writing in Walden. He's talking about his clothing. And he talks about how much he prefers his old clothes because over time they sort of form around him and become sort of personalized to his own body through his wearing them. And I think questions are sort of like this. One doesn't need a lot of questions in Zen practice. I think it's better just to root yourself in one question. And it doesn't even really have to be a question that you can articulate per se. But the process of wrestling with the question is sort of like Thoreau and his clothing. It becomes more and more in your body. It becomes more about the engagement. And I think that this is, when I explore questions in Zen practice, maybe an important distinction to make. Because there's the coming up with a question in one's life, and then there's the engaging of that question. And that's the practice. That's what's important. I mean, we must have a question in order to do this, but the point is the activity. Someone told me recently that the corrective is in the attempt. It almost doesn't really matter exactly what you do, but by engaging in life, life is self-corrective. And so the biggest mistake that you can make is to not engage it. And I think that this is sort of why having a question is important, is it is sort of the vehicle in which you do this. And what makes asking questions, I think, difficult from a Zen perspective is that this can be completely cerebral. But Zen practice doesn't really allow you to do that for very long if you engage it. Because eventually you start to wear your question. You start to embody it more and more. When I was studying here a few years ago, about the time I was taking Jukai, Edo-san brought her calligraphy teacher from Japan to give a demonstration here. And this was one of the, I think, big turning points in my practice, is seeing Tokunaga sensei perform calligraphy. Because it's like when she performed that calligraphy, it's like I could see her engagement in it in some way that was beyond her or that room or calligraphy. At that time, I sort of became very interested in art and really asking the question, why is art so fundamentally important to Zen practice? And in the Zen tradition, in Japan, it is believed that one cannot be a Zen master without being a calligraphy master. or one could not really call oneself a Zen master without being able to compose a compelling poem. And I think that this is true. I think that this practice is so similar to art and these expressions that the crossover is just obvious. And as I explored, the nature of art within Zen, I came across this book by Betty Edwards, and it was a very important book for me. And so Betty Edwards was teaching people how to draw. Her book that she is celebrated for is called Drawing from the Right Side of the Brain, in which she began drawing instruction as not a set of skills first, but as accessing the perceptual mode of the mind that is itself visual, because it's from this aspect of our minds that we do art. And so she was relying very heavily on the emergent research at the time that was exploring left brain, right brain. And so the idea is that when children learn to draw, they get better and better at drawing, and then they plateau, and then they often get worse at drawing. And if you don't draw in your adult life, you actually sort of draw at that stage of which you stopped developing. And what's very interesting is that plateau and that decline is really when children develop more sophisticated language, because they stop drawing from the visual mode of the mind and they start drawing symbols. So they aren't drawing the world as they see it, but as the symbols that they imagine represent it. And so the artist learns to disengage this sort of symbolic language aspect of the mind and just look at what they are seeing and just to draw that without this filter of language. And I think that this is very close actually to what we are doing in Zen practice. And so Betty Edwards had these skills that you could do that to trick the analytic mind into abdicating control to the more imagistic aspects of the mind. And so you would flip a painting upside down and then draw it, and it wouldn't make any sense, and then you would flip them over, and it is sort of miraculous how well you would draw it without trying to make sense of it. And there are other exercises she would do that really just, the idea of her research, and she was working with the Nobel Prize winner, Dr. David Sperry, who was sort of the first person to look at split brain patients and the implications of this dual hemisphere that we have. Their conclusion was that the left hemisphere is actually a little bit more powerful than the right hemisphere in its ability to make itself in control. And so to engage the right hemisphere is sort of like giving yourself a task in which your analytic mind can't meet it. Like drawing the contours of your hands, this is very maddening to our symbolic minds. We can't make sense of that, and so we naturally shift to the more visual aspects of our mind. I think this is relevant to what we do when we come here, because we sit and we face a wall, and there's just nowhere for the analytic mind to go. And so we shift, I think, to these different ways of perceiving. I think this is exactly how our minds work. Maybe it's not the left hemisphere and right hemisphere exactly. I think we now know that there's a lot of overlap between these two. Maybe it's more like the limbic system of the mind and the neocortex. I don't know if the scientific implications are really all that necessary for our Zen practice. But I think the important thing to realize is there are different perceptions that our mind does in our symbolic thinking, in our language, and in our just being in the room. And I think we're really coming to train here to be in this room. And that's very different from this analytic way of thinking, of just giving language to things. I think that's sort of how I think about the rational mind, is that it's very great for doing science, going out into the world and forming a career and making money. But the analytic mind isn't so great at just being present and engaged with other people. And I find it sort of curious that we live in this time where you can go on the internet and hear any expert talk about anything you want or could think of to listen to. But yet we come here. And I think this is so important, because what we're really doing isn't engaging some set of knowledge that we are trying to glean, but to learn to be in this room together. And I think, maybe this talk is being recorded, but I'm not sure if I'm convinced that listening to that recording really engages the activity of a teisho. I think it's just being in this room together, learning to bring the question down into the body, to sort of wear it, to enter it, without engaging it in this symbolic way where we're trying to compartmentalize it. My uncle went on a sea trip for the first time, I think a few months ago, and he was telling me about it. And he said, it took him a while to sort of realize how much he enjoyed it, how relaxing it was, even though he was doing these jobs on the boat. From the time he woke up to the time he slept, he found it very peaceful. And it occurred to him that when you're on the boat, there is nothing that you have to worry about that is not on the boat. And I think our Zen practice is sort of like this in a way, that we come here and we don't have to worry or think about anything outside this room. And I think that this is a very important skill to learn. Because whatever you meet outside this room is exactly like this room. You're always engaging the thing that you are in, and there's never an outside of that. And I think that this is part of why we need a question. Because the metaphor isn't exactly right as it pertains to Zen practice. Because to imagine that there is a boat is to imagine that there is something outside of the boat. I think maybe my uncle was a little bit more peaceful before he realized that, when he was just doing the thing. But I think we have the question to realize the fact that there is no separation. We wear the question. It becomes so embodied in our life that it isn't abstracted anymore. And we sort of learn to relate to language maybe that way. I've noticed something curious about our society, in that I think it's just assumed that if you want to think rationally, you have to go to a school for a very long time and read a lot of books and have really good teachers, and to develop your skills and capacity to be rational, because it's not really that easy to do that. And I think we sort of neglect the fact that training intuition is a lot like that. I think my feeling is that most of the people I meet sort of have this sense that people are intuitive or they aren't. That you sort of have an innate capacity or you don't. But I think intuition is just like this other part of our mind, this rational part of our mind. I think it takes a lot of training and cultivation to hone it and to unlock its potential. And that happens through engaging it. And that's sort of, I think, the thing that's very difficult in our society is that you cannot read a book about developing intuition. You can't. That sort of, I think, undermines the whole process. I think you can sort of trick yourself into thinking that you are being embodied when you're thinking that you're being embodied. I think it's quite a big problem. It's a hazard, I think, in Zen practice. This talk of questions, that it sounds a lot like koan practice. It's definitely not like koan practice as the Rinzai tradition practices koan practice. But I think it is sort of close to how I've been taught the koan tradition in the Soto, or the koan practice in the Soto tradition, where we believe that life itself is the koan. And so you don't really even have to have a koan, because life itself is paradoxical, and to engage it is to engage the nature of koan practice. So it is the activity itself, the working through of just being in life, that really is, I think, the question. And so I think it's a lot like that saying, like it's in the attempt that we find the corrective. Just in engaging it, I think life sort of miraculously does work itself through. And I think that we're starting to know more and more how much more powerful and how much more ancient these intuitive aspects of our mind are. And when I talk about life sort of working itself through, I don't think that that comes from a very analytic place. Because I think if you go down too much analytic thinking, it's almost like you can lose of your sense of life, the thing behind the symbols, which is so much more real and so much more engaging, and where art and practice arise, where meeting people arise. I think we do this because it's more effective, but also because it's a better way to live. I think it's better to live in our bodies than in our symbols, in our language. And it's sort of a weird thing about being a human being is I think both are actually very possible. And sort of how I understand the world and where we are at collectively is a lot of people are really just living in their heads and in their ideas. And you sort of take people's humanity away when you do that, because you sort of lose the capacity to engage where life happens. And this is why it's so important to engage our practice and to have that fire of a question burning within us, of just activity in whatever form it is, whatever form it takes. And I highly encourage all of you to explore some artistic expression, which I think are maybe obvious reasons. Maybe you have some questions. The question, when I think of myself in the student role in these moments, I think what I'm really trying to do is find this material in my own life. And it doesn't really even have to be like trying to gain some information, but to sort of test your understanding. I know you have thoughts around this. Maybe you don't have some particular set thing that you want to know. But please consider this. When our teacher returns, it's so important to engage that aspect of practice, to sort of test where we are, because that really allows us to know where we are. It's very important.